Traveling the Vortex. Side Trip.
Hello and welcome to this special side trip. I promised a few months back, and yes, I know it's been a while back and I'm delayed, but that I might continue some of my comic reviews in a side trip episode, so I'm going to attempt to do that. Don't worry, we are planning on coming back on the podcast. Things have been very crazy, but we are coordinating to get back together and start doing regular episodes. It may take a little different format. It may take a little different release schedule, but all of that's coming in the next coming weeks. Updates on that, we'll let you know. But until then, hopefully we can tide you over with a few little goodies as we go along. And as I mentioned, I'm going to review the next in my comic read-along. What I'm doing is I've gone back and I've decided to go through all of the comic adventures for all of the Doctors, starting with the first Doctor, and proceeding all the way up until the most current Doctor. Might be quite of an endeavor, so it might take a little while, but that's what I'm doing. Started with the first Doctor, and I'm going in somewhat chronological order. And what I'm doing, if you don't recall, is Andrew Carey has a website, and I'll put it in the show notes, called Doctor Who: The Complete Adventures. What he's done is he's attempted to put everything together in a complete chronology. I think he's taken some liberties, but I think he's also used some educated guesses, and some obvious things, go in order, but I think a lot of it takes some speculation and educated guesses. But he's sort of put a timeline together of how everything works together, how everything, for people like me that are, completists, and I want kind of everything to fit in the chronology in some way or another. He's kind of done that for us and put those together, and I sort of adhere to his, he's certainly done more research on it than I ever have, so I kind of adhere to his judgment on these. And so what I've done is I've gone through, and he lists everything from comics to books to TV series to trading cards to audios, just everything he's really got listed on here, and it's quite a thorough list, and like I say, you should check it out if you're interested. But that's what I'm using to kind of go through and see where the comics fall, linearly anyway. And in the past, I have started with as I said, the first Doctor, and started with Operation Proteus, which was the first story that chronologically that the comics would take place. That was with the first Doctor and Susan. The In-Between Times, The Path of Skulls, let's see, Religious Experience, and Are You Listening? Those are all adventures that so far have been with Ian and Barbara and Susan, and then Ian and Barbara and Vicky. At some point, I explained this on the last time I talked to you about this, but I explained that at one point, the Doctor in his travels leaves, and he meets up with two other grandchildren called John and Gillian. And according to the Doctor Who: The Complete Adventure, Andrew's placed these right kind of near after the Dalek master plan. Sort of in that era. He's been traveling with Stephen. He steps away, and I think it says at one time, having glimpsed his future, the Doctor is more aware of his own mortality and feels the need to come to terms with his coming regeneration. Having been granted some degree of freedom by Rassilon, which must be in a previous story in there, he decides not to return to Stephen immediately, but to travel on his own for a while. So at some point, he has left Stephen at this point. And there's some stories in there in between, some short stories, it looks like, maybe some other prose. But he's stepped away, and this is where this nicely fits, because these adventures with John Gillian are, kind of offshoots. They were released in the 1960s in TV Comics. TV Comics got the license from BBC to do Doctor Who. And what they needed something, I think, to connect with young readers. And so they chose two young, probably in their, for us in the U.S., we'd call it elementary schools, but late primary school, maybe early junior high or middle school, as they call it now. And they join him on this first adventure, and many subsequent adventures as well. But John and Gillian, they don't really know their grandfather, at least from some of the dialogue that John speaks to Gillian. They don't recognize him when they first meet him, but John's been told that the Doctor's an inventor or something, and they're from the 20th century, and they address the Doctor as Doctor Who or grandfather. So they address him as both. But what they do is they find their grandfather in the alley in his TARDIS, and he is tinkering around, and he's about to take off. And you get the impression he knows that they're coming, because he greets them when they come through, and he tells them, look, take you on an adventure. And so they decide to go into the 29th century, which is the future. He promises them an adventure, and they come across this group of pacifists. Actually, they fall into the middle of an attack on this group of pacifists that by some alien beings called the Kleptons, and you can tell sort of, and I think I've read that they wanted to use, the writers of this comic series wanted to use the Daleks, and they could not get clearance, I'm assuming from Terry Nation, to use them. And so instead, and I wish I could remember what the writer's name here of this particular series, but Jeremy Bentham. If you want to know, I'm using the comic strip companion, the unofficial and unauthorized guide to Doctor Who comics from 1964 to 1979. It's written by Paul Scoons, and it's quite a wealth of information. But Jeremy Bentham, you could tell he wanted to use the Daleks and wasn't going to be allowed to. So I think some last-minute scrambling, they reworked it to make these kind of nondescript little green men called the Kleptons. And if you Google their image on Google, on the internet, you'll find the design is very, very basic. They are little green men. They almost look kind of fish-like. Look like they've got gills with a long nose and really big eyes. But the Doctor walks into this skirmish, and the Kleptons are essentially trying to take over and use the pacifists for slave labor, because they know that they're not going to fight back. They're just not warriors, and so they're utilizing them for slave labor. They end up, the Doctor and John and Gillian end up sneaking on board one of the crafts that's crash landed, and return with the Kleptons to their underwater city. And they break in and they find the prisoners that are there. They basically lead insurgents against the captors. Typical fare. I mean, it's pretty much a capture and rescue. The Doctor is written much different than William Hartnell even was at this time in the series. The Doctor in these strips are very, he's very bold and brash. He's ready to run into danger. He's more of the hero. He's more of, I think, the heroic character that he's not necessarily so much in the series on television. But anyway, through a series of insurrection, I suppose, they end up defeating the Kleptons and blowing up their city. And they go back, and that's pretty much where it ends. The pacifists end up asking him and the kids to stay, and they say, no, thank you. We've got to move on to our next adventure. Or I think he's about to take them home. And that's where it kind of ends. But we know that there's lots of adventures coming. It's an interesting story. It's nothing to write home about. It's what I like about it, I think, the most is it's quaint. It has sort of this quaint, nostalgic sci-fi feel. And by that, I don't mean that I read any comics from the 1960s. I wasn't born until the early 70s. So I obviously didn't have that. But there's a certain charm that I think that pop culture from the 60s and 70s, and even more so, maybe a little more charming from British comics. Just they have this unique character. And it's interesting because there's not always a lot of panels of action. There's a lot of dialogue in these comics, but the artwork's terrific. They do a good job, and there is action. You do see it happening, but you find the story is driven more still by dialogue than it is by the panels in which it represents. And I suppose that's because they're having to tell so many stories, and there's probably 6 panels per page. There's 20 pages. These were released, I think, 2 pages each weekly in TV Comic, or maybe it was even monthly in TV Comic. So to stretch them out, but it wasn't very long as far as the pages go cumulatively, but they have to get a lot of story in there, so there's a lot of dialogue. John and Gillian it's interesting. They're the replacement for Susan in a way. As I mentioned earlier, you can tell that there's sort of the connection to the younger audience that might have been reading comics at this time. I think it allows you to, as a young person, to maybe connect better on a different level by reading it through the eyes of somebody that's probably closer to their age, of their target audience anyway. I think it's fascinating that at one point, John is certainly much more hero, lead the charge than most 6th, 7th graders would be at the time. And the Doctor kind of allows for this, and I think that that's kind of interesting. That while I don't think the Doctor has always been super careful, it seemed like any time that it was Susan or Vicky involved, he was very much on the side of caution with those, and I think he would be more so for 2 grandchildren that are much younger than even those 2 were. It never explains how John and Julian are, from the 20th century Earth, and the Doctor, who is, as we later know, and now know, retroactively, is from Gallifrey, another planet, and another time even. We don't know how they're related, and I don't think it's ever explained. In fact, I'd say it's never explained. I think that it's kind of quasi-explained in an 8th Doctor story later on. But we'll have to get there. But I don't think it matters how they're connected. They could be friends. It doesn't, It's just, my kids used to call some of my friends, or some of their friends' parents, aunt and uncle. They're not really aunt and uncle, but that was, kind of a term of endearment. So could be a situation like that, but I don't think it really matters for the story. But there's a lot more of the TV comics to go. So there'll be a lot that I'll be going through from those. Looks like there's probably about 24 of them before I move away to annuals. But so there's quite a bit, and I think I'm just going to do this one this time, but I may pair these up as I do more of them in order to just kind of get through more of the stories. But if you're continuing to enjoy these, let me know. And give us some feedback. Like I say, the show will be coming back soon, but I hope you enjoyed this little review of Doctor Who and the Klepton Parasites. And I guess until next time, cheers.
You have been listening to Traveling the Vortex. Doctor Who and all of its associated programs are owned and trademarked by the BBC. No infringement is intended or implied.